In 1554, a French theologian published a commentary that would revolutionize how Christians read the Bible's opening book. John Calvin's commentary on Genesis wasn't just another ancient text analysis. It introduced a radical idea. What if God, in his infinite wisdom, deliberately simplified his message so humans could actually understand it? Calvin called this principle accommodation. Think of it like a parent explaining the universe to a 5-year-old. You don't launch into quantum physics. You use simple words, familiar images, stories they can grasp. Calvin argued that's exactly what God does in Genesis. When Moses describes creation in 6 days, Calvin suggests we're not getting a scientific lecture. We're getting a story shaped for human minds. The infinite creator is accommodating himself to finite creatures. This changes everything about how we read Scripture. Calvin writes that Moses accommodated his discourse to common usage. God isn't dumbing down the truth. He's translating eternity into time, infinity into language we can hold. It's an act of love, not limitation. This principle becomes Calvin's lens for the entire book. Every narrative, every genealogy, every covenant promise gets read through this question. How is God making himself known in ways we can receive? When Calvin approaches Genesis 1, he sees Moses writing not as a scientist but as a theologian. The 6-day structure, it's pedagogical. God could have created everything in an instant, but the sequential days teach us something about order, purpose, design. Calvin notes how each day builds toward humanity. Light, sky, land, plants, sun, and stars, animals, all preparing a home. Then finally, humans made in God's image, not as an afterthought but as the climax. The accommodation here is profound. God gives us a story we can follow with rhythm and progression. But Calvin doesn't romanticize creation. He moves quickly to Genesis 3. The fall isn't just historical event, it's theological catastrophe. When Adam and Eve eat the fruit, they're not just breaking a rule. They're rejecting their creaturely status, grasping for knowledge that belongs to God alone. Calvin is brutally honest about the consequences. Sin doesn't just damage humans, it corrupts everything. The ground itself is cursed. Work becomes toil. Childbirth brings pain. Death enters the world. This isn't metaphor for Calvin, it's literal cosmic rupture. Yet even here, accommodation appears. God doesn't abandon his creatures. He makes clothes for them. He promises a serpent crusher from Eve's offspring. The gospel is whispered in Genesis 3:15 long before it's shouted from Golgotha. Calvin's treatment of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is where his pastoral heart shines. These aren't perfect heroes. They're flawed, fearful, frequently failing, and that's precisely the point. When God calls Abraham in Genesis 12, he's not choosing him because of merit. Calvin emphasizes that grace precedes everything. Abraham doesn't earn the covenant, he receives it. The promise comes first, faith follows, but Calvin doesn't shy away from Abraham's failures. Twice, Abraham lies about Sarah being his sister, risking her honor to save his skin. Calvin is scathing. This shows how even faith's pioneers can act with disgraceful cowardice. Yet God's promise holds. The covenant doesn't depend on Abraham's performance. Isaac. Calvin sees him as somewhat passive, living in his father's shadow. The real drama is Rebekah and Jacob deceiving Isaac for the blessing. Calvin struggles with this. How can God's plan unfold through such obvious sin? His answer, God isn't endorsing the deception, he's working through it. Jacob gets the blessing, but he'll spend 20 years with Laban learning what it means to be deceived. God's providence uses even human sin to accomplish his purposes, but that doesn't make the sin less sinful. Jacob's wrestling match at Peniel captivates Calvin. A man physically grappling with God. Here's accommodation at its most visceral. God takes on a form Jacob can touch, wrestle, resist. And in that struggle, Jacob is transformed. He limps away renamed Israel, the one who strives with God. But it's the Joseph narrative where Calvin's theology of providence reaches its zenith. 11 chapters, nearly a quarter of Genesis, devoted to one family's dysfunction and redemption. Calvin sees Joseph's story as a masterclass in divine sovereignty. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, a horrific betrayal. Then Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him, injustice compounded. Then the cupbearer forgets him in prison, hope deferred. Yet every apparent disaster is a hidden setup. Calvin writes that God's providence works by wonderful and hidden means. Slavery leads to Potiphar's house. False accusation leads to prison. Prison leads to Pharaoh's court. Pharaoh's court leads to saving not just Egypt, but Jacob's entire family. When Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, he doesn't say, "You sold me, but I forgive you." He says something more profound. "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." Calvin pounces on this. Human intentions and divine purposes can run simultaneously. The brothers genuinely sinned. God genuinely orchestrated redemption. Both are true. This is Calvin's doctrine of providence in narrative form. God isn't just reacting to human choices, scrambling to salvage his plan. He's weaving every thread, good and evil, faithful and sinful, into a tapestry we can't yet see. The famine that drives Jacob's family to Egypt, it's setting up Exodus. Israel needs to become numerous, and that won't happen in Canaan. Egypt is the incubator. Joseph's elevation is the bridge. What looks like tragedy is actually stage setting for liberation. So how does Calvin actually read these texts? His method is distinctive for the 16th century. First, he prioritizes the literal sense. Unlike medieval commentators who loved allegory, Calvin asks, what did Moses mean to communicate? What would the original audience have understood? This makes him, in many ways, a forerunner of modern historical critical method. But literal doesn't mean wooden. Calvin recognizes literary devices. When God walks in the garden or repents of making humanity, Calvin knows these are anthropomorphisms, human language accommodating divine reality. Second, Calvin is deeply Christological. Genesis isn't just ancient history, it's pointing forward. The promised seed of the woman, that's Christ. The ram caught in the thicket replacing Isaac, that's substitutionary atonement foreshadowed. Judah's scepter that won't depart, that's the Davidic line culminating in Jesus. Third, Calvin is relentlessly practical. He's not writing for academics. He's writing for pastors and laypeople. What does this passage teach about God? About human nature? About how to live? When he discusses Abraham's justification by faith in Genesis 15, he's thinking about Reformation debates with Rome. When he examines Jacob's deathbed blessings, he's pondering how parents should spiritually guide their children. The text is ancient. The application is immediate. Running through Calvin's entire commentary is covenant. God is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. This is how he chooses to relate to humanity after the fall. The covenant with Noah establishes creation's stability. Never again will flood destroy everything. The rainbow is God's sign, his accommodation to our need for tangible assurance. The covenant with Abraham is more specific. Land, offspring, blessing to all nations. Calvin sees this as the gospel in seed form. Paul's argument in Galatians about Abraham being justified by faith. Calvin's already making that connection in Genesis. But here's what fascinates Calvin, the covenant ceremonies. When God passes between the animal pieces in Genesis 15, Calvin notes it's God alone who binds himself. Abraham is asleep. This is unilateral promise. God is essentially saying, "May I be torn apart like these animals if I break this covenant." The covenant with Jacob at Bethel. God doesn't say, "If you obey, then I'll bless you." He says, "I will be with you." Promise first always, this covenant structure becomes the backbone of Reformed theology. God initiates, God promises, God fulfills. Human response is faith, receiving what God offers. Works follow, but they are fruit, not root. Calvin's commentary on Genesis, published in 1554, emerged in a world being torn apart by religious controversy. Catholics and Protestants were debating authority, salvation, Scripture itself. In this context, Calvin returns to the beginning, to Genesis, to the foundational narratives of creation, fall, promise, providence. He reads them with fresh eyes, insisting that God has spoken clearly enough for us to understand, yet mysteriously enough to keep us humble. His principle of accommodation reminds us that revelation is a gift. God condescends to our level. He speaks our language. He wraps infinite truth in finite words. And those words about a garden, a flood, a family of flawed patriarchs, those words are sufficient. They teach us who God is, sovereign, gracious, faithful. They teach us who we are. Created, fallen, covenanted. They point us forward to a promised seed who will crush the serpent's head and bless all nations. Calvin didn't just write a commentary. He modeled a way of reading Scripture that takes the text seriously as both human and divine. Moses is a real author in real history. But through Moses, God is speaking, and what he's speaking is ultimately about Christ. For Calvin, Genesis isn't just the beginning of the Bible. It's the beginning of understanding how God makes himself known. And that knowledge, received by faith, transforms everything. When you read Calvin on Genesis, you're not just learning about ancient Near Eastern history. You're encountering the God who accommodates, who condescends, who covenants. The God who turns tragedy into triumph, who weaves human sin into divine sovereignty, who promises and delivers. That's the God of Genesis. And for John Calvin, that's the God who changes the world.